Hi, welcome to this Kaplan Masterclass on wordy questions made easy, and my name is Iryna McDonald. This masterclass will cover the following 4 issues. We know that in wordy questions in particular, it is very important to read the question requirements carefully. Actually, one of the biggest issues where students struggle when it comes to passing the exam, it is not reading or not understanding the question requirements correctly. So we're going to devote a lot of attention to what you need to be looking for when you're reading those question requirements. We will then look at how to read the scenario and plan. And the planning may not be something you had to do for your objective test exams. In a discursive paper, it is an essential technique to help you make sure that everything you've seen in a scenario, you can understand how that will relate to your answer. You make the best use of the information available to you. We're also going to talk about writing out your answer, whether your exam is handwritten or computer-based. How do you get your points across in a concise way, but also maximizing the marks available to you? And finally, time management. We know how time pressured those exams are. Every minute matters. So we're going to look at a few hints and tips of how to make best use of that available time. So let's start at the beginning by looking at how question requirements need to be read. In reading the question requirements, there are certain things you need to be mindful for. So initially, you might need to look at the key verbs. What is it that the examiner wants to do? Is the examiner asking you to explain a commonly used word that asks you to explain the meaning of the concept and why certain things have happened to the organization and scenario? Or are you asked to evaluate? Are you asked to criticize? Each of those key verbs carries a different meaning. Once you've understood the verb, you also need to look at the topic. And here we need to think about the technical aspects of the question. So when you read the requirements, it might be important to brainstorm, think through the topic, kind of prepare yourself mentally for what is going to come in a scenario, because you have some background understanding of the topic. It makes it much easier for you to find relevant information when you're reading through a scenario. We'll think about the format of the answer. How do you present your response if you asked to write a report or a memo? And of course, in reading the question requirements, you think about the structure. What are the key components of the question requirements you need to be mindful of? Because in the same line of the question requirements, there may be more than one component. So do pay attention to those specific points the examiner wants you to address. Read the question requirement line fully to understand how many things you're actually needing to do. Let's zoom in into some of those aspects one by one. And the first thing we're going to look at together is how to deal with the verbs in the exam. So here is a selection of verbs you might be able to see. As I mentioned previously, explain is probably one of the more popular ones. You will encounter it in many discursive papers. And explain means you need to make something very clear, so it's logical, it's easy to follow, and provide the reasons for the event. So when you're explaining something, mentally think to yourself, could you incorporate the word because into your sentence? So company performance has improved because we've been able to sell more goods to our customers. So the word because encourages you to provide rationale behind that judgment, and therefore helps you to score that mark. When you're asked to analyze, that means you are analyzing the information that the examiner is giving to you in that scenario, and you need to look at the situation, information that's provided, look at the separate parts, components of the situation, and interpret them. So if you're asked to analyze the current position of the organization, you will need to think how to split that position. What are we doing well? What are we doing badly? And then interpret each element saying, why are we doing well? Or why are we doing badly in a particular area? With discussion, the easiest way to approach discussion is to look at pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. Yeah. So discussion asks you to provide a variety of different points of view, and advantages and disadvantages ask you to consider the situation from many different perspectives. Whereas the word criticize is only looking at the negatives, weaknesses, or problems. So when we're criticizing, we have to say, what are we doing wrong and why it is wrong? Often in questions when you need to criticize, examiner says, oh, here's some information put together by a junior member of staff, implying that this junior member of staff may not have appropriate experience and therefore would have made mistakes. So you ask to criticize the information put forward by this junior member of staff, which means to say, what are the errors and omissions this junior member of staff has made, why those are incorrect, why this information cannot be relied upon. Evaluate is a higher level verb that asks you to do a little bit more. So within evaluation, you still need to start your discussion with the pros and cons, for and against, but at the end of a discussion, you ask to provide a conclusion, overall summarize what you have found as a result of your evaluation. Recommend, occasionally you might see a recommend in your exam, and recommendation is asking you for appropriate action plan. So examiner could ask you to evaluate that particular strategy organization is pursuing and then recommend whether the strategy should be pursued. So when you're evaluating, you're going to look at pros and cons of the strategy, and your recommendation will continue with things like, we will adopt the strategy and justify why the strategy should be adopted, or if you decide the strategy is not viable, why the strategy should be rejected. Moving on to the answer formats. In terms of the common formats you might see in the exam, when it comes to letter, email, and memo, in the exam, they pretty much look the same. It may not be the same in real life, but exams, we know, are not always about real life. So as long as we take hints from the examiner and provide the simple format that's expected, that will help us to gain more marks. So if you're doing letter, email, or memo, you just have to do to, from, date, subject. To is the party that asks you for that correspondent. For example, the board of directors of the company. From, here you need to be mindful that all the exam scripts are supposed to be anonymous, as an examiner doesn't really want to know what your actual name is. If you're given a name or job title in scenario, that is the name of the job title you should be using when you're writing the from line. Date, you need to think about the dates that might be given to you in the scenario. Many scenarios are arranged in a chronological order when you need to address events in a particular time sequence, and therefore the date will relate to the timing of this event to which the question relates. And of course, subject, what is your letter, email, or memo covering? Generally, we want to keep those subject lines short to save ourselves time. In terms of the body of your letter, email, or memo, start with dear, dear whom you're writing to, dear Mr. Smith, if that is who asked you for that correspondence, and finish your letter, email, or memo with sincerely. And again, we don't write our actual name at the bottom of the correspondence. We will use the job title or whatever is the name that's given to you in that scenario. With the report, things will look just slightly differently. So we still have the usual to, from, and subject, but within the report, we're also expected to briefly introduce that report by looking at the main aims, What will your report be covering? What will the reader learn from your report? The main body of report should be split into paragraphs containing either analysis or evaluation of the issues relating to the question requirements. And report implies that at the bottom, we need to have either conclusion or recommendation, depending on the verb used by the examiner. Moving on, let's now consider our next stage of preparing our answer. So we already learned what makes for good reading of question requirements. Now we need to understand what we need to do when we're reading the scenario. And in a wordy discursive paper, it's important to read and plan at the same time, because some of the scenarios you might encounter will be rather lengthy. It's going to be difficult to retain that information purely in your head for the duration of time allocated to this question. So if we read actively, if we are able to grasp information given to us quickly, it will help us to manage our time in the exam. So what does it mean to read actively? Instead of just scanning through the paragraph, you go, okay, why am I told this? Which question requirement will this relate to? Is it requirement 1, 2, 3? Is it part A or B? Because every bit of information in scenario is given to you for a reason. So if there is a big paragraph in a scenario that you have not highlighted, underlined, or made any use of, look at it again and go, why is it here? I might have missed something. It is very unusual for examiner to give you a lot of text that is not useful as part of your answer. So glance at that paragraph that you haven't really made use of and go, I probably have missed something. What is it that examiner is trying to tell me in that paragraph? As I said, you need to read and plan simultaneously. And though you might not have planned in your objective test exams or in your numerical papers, for a wordy paper, that is a must. So as you are reading, you're going, okay, why am I told this information? Which requirement it relates to? And straight away bring this into your plan, whether you're planning on a separate sheet that might be provided to you on the day of the exam, or you're planning on the screen if your exam is computer-based. Either way, plan will give you that important starting point so you keep yourself on track with the questions as you go along. A good plan will help you to structure your answer, because a good plan will contain key headings, key aspects of the issues that you want to further develop when it comes to writing your answer. And we want to have short plans. As in your plan, you might have a word that will trigger you to help you remember what the issue was, so you can then develop it into a full sentence when it comes to writing out the answer. And timing, I have already mentioned that exams are fairly time pressured. So to keep yourself on track with the time, you could start planning for time as well, as in write out that timing deadline next to the question requirements. How many minutes in the exam do you have allocated to tackle that particular question or a component of the question? And that will keep you reminded that you need to move on, because a good technique in the exam is to attempt all question requirements. Some of them will be easier, some of them will be harder, but there are always straightforward marks in each of the requirements. So by having a go at each requirement, you actually maximize your chances of passing the exam as a whole. Let's now move on to the next step and think about writing out your answer. So by writing out, I don't mean necessarily physically writing. That could be typing out your answer as well if you're sitting your exam on computer. So markers do want to know what it is that you're answering, so do clearly show which requirement you're attempting. For example, you could start your answer by saying, this is my answer to the requirement 1A, and then type your answer. The markers do like headings. We said your plan might contain headings to keep you on track, and the markers like headings as well because it demonstrates to the marker that you've thought what you want to talk about. The headings help the marker to understand that you're discussing the right issues in a scenario and therefore create good attitude when it comes to markers marking your script. In your answer, we still want to be concise and avoid repetition. We want to avoid those unnecessary words. We want to avoid the waffle. We want to avoid generic expressions because they waste our time and don't give us any marks. If we could be to the point, if we focus on the essence of what we want to communicate, that is best from a perspective of getting marks, as well as from perspective of managing the exam time. However, concise doesn't mean that we could just write a word or two and expect to get a mark. Examiner wants you to add value in your points. And that means provide an explanation as to why your point is relevant or why your point is significant. Remember that word because I mentioned earlier on? So company's performance has improved because we've been able to sell more products to our customers. So that is about maybe a line and a half of typed up text, but because forces you to explain why your point is significant, why it's relevant, and therefore helps you to secure that 1 mark. In terms of presentation, do start each point on a new line because that encourages the marker to pause at the end of the sentence and go, what is the idea that's been communicated here? Is it worth the mark? Probably yes. And as the marker pauses and awards you marks, the more times that marker pauses, the more marks you are able to get, the higher are the chances that you will pass your exam. Let's now have a look at saving the time and what it means to be concise. So I'll give you a moment to read through those 2 submissions from students, answer A and answer B. As you can see, both submissions are talking about the same thing, but somehow answer B has managed to do it in half of the number of words and therefore save themselves a lot of time. Therefore, answer B student that wrote the answer B will have more time in the exam to write other points. So what is the difference? What has the second student done to be concise to the point and still get the same quantity of marks? So the student is cutting out all the unnecessary vocabulary. So the fact that employees have a high level of interest is a significant factor, but we don't need to introduce those generic statements that employees would be expected. We can just get to the point and say employees have a high level of interest. Remember, we need to explain why they have high level of interest, because their jobs are under threat. And we could add a little bit of scenario evidence because the departments might be closed down. So if we get rid of generic statements, if we get rid of unnecessary information, if we get rid of niceties, as in it's currently under consideration, I'm very grateful for contacting me to request this information. Exam is about being to the point and communicating the essentials. So if you cut out the waffle, if you cut out generic introductions, if you cut out unnecessary statements, you're going to be able to make the same point in fewer words, and that will give you more time to gain the marks. Finally, let's think about what we could do to improve your written skills. We know that writing is very different from discussing a point or reading about the point. So therefore, written skill is something that needs to be practiced. Like you practice your calculation, repeat them time and time again to get better. The same will happen with your written skills. The more you practice, the better you're going to get at writing. So To improve your writing, you need to take a step back, look at your own submission and go, okay, have I done a good job? And I know it's very difficult to reread your own answer. It's very difficult to be self-critical, but if you try, you will learn a lot from it. So have a look at whether your points have been clear. Have you got your point across? Were they easy to find, structured in a nice way under different headings? If you're struggling with this initially, why not ask for help? If you have a friend, a parent, or another student with whom you can exchange your work and ask them for some honest feedback, you'll be able to learn very quickly and improve your reading skills. We also said it's important to be concise. So if you're looking at a lengthy paragraph that only communicates one idea and therefore will only get you 1 mark, think about, are there any unnecessary words that are in that paragraph? Have we added information that doesn't relate to the point? Are we focusing on niceties? Are we mentioning things that are not actually enhancing that point? As we've seen from the previous slides, 2 students communicating the same idea could use vastly different number of words. So try to see whether you could say the same thing in fewer words. Line and a half of tab type text is generally what it takes to get that 1 mark. So do practice writing concise answers. For some of the topics that you might find more difficult, those are the topics that you need to spend a little bit more time writing things out for, and you will notice that you will remember those topics better, as well as, of course, improve your writing skills overall. So think about what is the idea that you're trying to get across. Think about whether it's applied to scenario, whether it's clear and well explained. And the more times you do it, the better you're going to get at it. Of course, technical accuracy also matters. So examiners do often provide model answers outlining for you what the key points you should have in your answer to be able to score marks. And though the model answers are often quite lengthy, they're designed to provide a variety of different viewpoints because different students could approach an issue from different perspectives. So we don't expect your answer to be exactly the same as the examiner's answer. But for technical accuracy, it's important to double check whether you're roughly talking about the same things in the same way. Finally, I want to thank you for attending this masterclass. I hope it made it easier for you to attempt your discursive wordy papers. And I hope that one day we're going to be able to see each other in class, whether it's in a physical class or live online class, where we can continue this conversation further. Lots of luck in your exams.